Hey Claire, can you hear me? I don't, is my mic on? Does anybody know?
I can hear you.
Okay, awesome.
Oh,
Yeah,
wait.
there you are.
Okay, there we go.
There you go. Oh, that's who I hear sometimes. What a sweetie.
Yeah. Oh, come here. Who is it?
Oh, what
Yeah.
a cute dog. What kind of dog is he?
She's a standard poodle American bulldog mix.
Whoa. Somebody went nuts and
I
said,
think,
"Ooh," they said, let's see what we can make.
yeah, really. I think that's just kind of how it happened. Like the vet that I got her from, they had a show poodle and a breeding American bulldog, and then
And the two found each other without
yeah,
permission, most likely.
oh, definitely not. She was
He's
like, I
she
can't
is
sell these, so here.
she is gorgeous though.
Yeah, she has her fur gets really, really long too. Like I had to shave her completely off this summer, but her fur gets to be about like 4 inches long or so.
Does it need cutting like a poodle's, or does it shed more like a bulldog?
It sheds a little bit,
Yeah,
not like not like our other dog,
yeah.
but I do have to keep
Oh,
her like shaved down. I have to brush her. She gets dreadlocks, and then she brings leaves in the house, and God knows what else.
your dog has dreadlocks.
She does. She gets dreadlocks, and I have to cut them out. It's so bad.
A little Rastafarian dog. That's what she is. Oh, she's a cutie.
Yeah.
Well, I am going to get us started, and we're gonna talk about chapter 6, which is an overview of epidemiology designs. And there are, I can do my camera. I always forget where my camera is here. I don't know. I started, I stop it, I started. Okay. So, so if we remember from, we talked a little bit about this last week, but there are basically two types of epidemiology designs. They're going to be the descriptive and there's going to be more the analytic and scientific. And so when you're looking at descriptive, you're just basically doing surveillance, like you're monitoring the public's health. You may be evaluating the success of some intervention programs. And it's really good for generating hypotheses about what causes a disease. Now, once you move into the analytic scientific phase, then you're really talking more evaluating hypotheses. So you're actually going to move into the testing of hypotheses, and you're going to move into trying to determine whether an intervention has been successful. A lot of the times it will be, people think clinical trials or experimental studies. We're going to talk a little bit about one your book doesn't talk about, which is quasi-experimental, which is one of the ones that most often gets done by health educators. It's the closest thing most health educators do to a clinical trial. So the other term that gets used a lot is the term observational. And observational studies can either be descriptive or they can be analytic. But an observational study, the only thing that makes it observational is that you don't allocate treatment. So you don't, the investigator doesn't say, hey, you guys get an intervention and you guys don't get an intervention, which is what happens in clinical and experimental and in quasi-experimental. In case control studies and cohort studies, they're natural experiments, so no treatment gets allocated. So what we're going to be looking at is to understand the key components of analytic studies, and it's just a brief understanding. You're going to get to go through each of the studies. Oh, I need to admit everybody. You're going to be going through those studies in separate chapters, and then begin to identify the main types of analytic studies, understand what the key features are so you can distinguish among them, and also sort of start determinations about maybe what most would work under certain circumstances, and then also to understand what the strengths and limitations of each of the designs are. So moving along. So if you look at the goals and the types of decisions that are made in epidemiological research, there are things that people need to figure out how you're going to determine what exposures are. That becomes very important. Also, what your population, who is it you're studying? How are you going to define a disease or an outcome? How are you going to make that determination? How are you going to measure it? The other is, how can you make the study accurate? Depending on how you select your participants to a study, you may be introducing bias. And also, by determining how you're going to measure and what you're going to measure, you may introduce confounding, you may introduce third variables you're not aware of. And then there's always random error. That's one of the things that really just exists. So those are the things that are part of trying to make your study accurate. And then how do you make it efficient? Because a lot of studies are very time consuming. Some of the studies, particularly things like experimental studies with human beings, are actually kind of expensive. So where's that money coming from? And if you are going to be doing a clinical trial or an experimental study, how do you make it work, given how many resources you're putting into it? So those are all going to be important. So these are the components of every study that is an epidemiological study. You're going to have a population. You're going to have them have an exposure. That is the exposure of interest. There's going to be some kind of outcome. You know, it could be that somebody develops a disease or not, or somebody improves from a disease or not, or that somebody just learns a new skill or changes their behavior. Those are all possible outcomes depending on what your study is about. You also need to take into account any potential third variables you weren't, that you're not really interested in studying, but you need to make sure that you control for them. And that's what you do with confoundings, you control for them. And then you need to worry about what type of analysis is going to be appropriate for whatever study that you're conducting and whatever is the measurement of association you're going to measure. And then you have to figure out how you're going to communicate those findings and kind of inform the world of your research. So those are true to every single type of study you're going to do. So when we talk about population, what are we talking about? Well, there's always a source population. The source population is the population that you're ideally interested in being able to make generalizations from your study to. Okay, so these are the people that you want your study to apply, and you want to know more about them. Now, your study population are the people you enroll in your study. Okay, so you're interested in the source population, but this is basically your sample. This is your study population. And so you want them to be as similar to your source population as possible because you want to be able to generalize back to the source population. Now, depending on how you do that, you get closer or further from the source population. So, for example, one study that you'll see a lot in epidemiology books is a cohort study called the Nurses' Health Study. And there were very good reasons for selecting this particular cohort of people. It's primarily female. They're nurses. So they're well-educated people who know about their health. And so there were good reasons that were scientific because they were interested in looking at women's health, but also practical. This population really understood why they needed to be part of a study, and they were more likely to be followed up. So, so those are going to be the practical reasons. Now, is it generalizable, however, right? So if you find something in the Nurses' Health Study, is it necessarily generalizable to the entire population? So if you assume that those associations that you actually see in the population are real, are they true for everybody? And that, I mean, I can't, you know, it's one of those where you can't really come up, I can't give you an answer. I think it depends on who you're trying to generalize to. Well, be aware that primarily female, primarily educated. And we know, well, we probably do know, if you don't know yet, you will find out, is that education is a protective factor. So the more education that people have, the more likely they are to be healthy. So Okay, so the other term we use is the word outcome. And what do we mean by an outcome? Well, an outcome is really any event that you're interested in studying, okay? And so for epidemiologists that are in that really work more in that kind of the medical model, it's usually a disease. So when they're talking about an outcome, they're talking about, you know, how many people have had, say, let's say they work in cardiovascular health, and maybe talking about how many people had a coronary event, for example. But it could also be an injury, it could be an event, it could be a state. If you are doing this type of research and you're working more in the health education setting, it is often, as I said, changes in behavior, changes in knowledge. Um, so it really kind of depends on which way you're looking at, but it's really any event that you're interested in studying. So if you're looking, for example, at cardiovascular disease, most often you're going to be defining cardiovascular disease based on ICD codes. You want to be as precise as possible in your measurement of the outcome. It's very important. If you're looking, for example, for a woman that has the first occurrence of breast cancer, you can find that in a cancer registry. Okay, so that's a source of that outcome. If you, for instance, are looking at a child who has some kind of structural abnormality of the heart, for instance, like a foramen ovule or something that's not functioning in the heart, that's something that you want identified early on. And the reason that you try to narrow the definitions is to minimize error. You wouldn't want to wait later to see, for example, in the case of a heart abnormality that could maybe not be present at birth. So something that may be like a valve defect that could come later in life. So that's the main thing, defining your outcomes so that you can be comfortable that the people that you say are cases are in fact cases. The other thing that's important is measuring exposure. We said we have the population, we have the outcome, we move to the exposure. And the exposure is any factor that you're interested, that you believe has an effect on a particular outcome, whatever the outcome of interest is. So it could be constitutional, environmental, it could be behavioral. So for example, you may be looking in this case at genetics as an exposure, so a genetic polymorphism. You may be looking at female sex as an exposure. So a lot of the times people will say, well, is when you look at risk factors, they'll say things like, let's look at autoimmune disorders are more common in females than in males. So female sex in that case, in that description, becomes a risk factor for autoimmune diseases. Short stature can also be, for example, an exposure. So you see all these are genetic. Then you can look at more environmental ones. Fluoridated water, air pollution could be an exposure. Passive cigarette smoke can be an exposure. And then if you're looking at behavior, well, people who smoke, people who take illicit drugs, people who exercise enthusiastically, I guess, a fitness enthusiast, and having a high fiber diet. Again, the big thing with exposure is whatever it is that is the exposure, it's to measure it as precisely as possible to avoid overlap among the different categories, because the goal again is to minimize error. So the other thing we talked that all studies do is they try to control confoundings. And when we talk about a confounder, I always call it a third variable. The book calls it an extraneous determinant of an outcome. It's basically what it is. So you're interested in looking at two variables. So let's say in this case, they're interested in looking at the effect of pesticide on breast cancer, right? So pesticide often builds up in the body depending on the type of pesticide that's being looked at. But you could over time build up a certain amount of pesticide exposure in your body, and then you can also look at cancer. Well, one of the things that may lead to an erroneous association between pesticide levels of pesticides, say in the fatty tissue in the body and breast cancer, is age. Because the longer you're exposed to pesticide, the older you get, right? So you get older, the more likely you're exposed to pesticide. Well, breast cancer is also associated with aging. So normally, most people start seeing breast cancer after the age of 50 for the average population. So if you're not taking into account age, if you're not controlling for age and controlling that distortion, you may see an effect between pesticide and breast cancer that actually isn't really there, or maybe it's not as strong. So the big thing with confounders is to sort of identify them, think of all the possible things that could be confounding, and then control for them in some manner. And there are multiple ways of controlling for confounders, but that's a different chapter. It's one of my favorites, but we're not going there yet. And the next thing that matters is the analysis. So all studies will have some kind of analysis. And that's just basically you get your data and then you have to examine it so you can make some sense of it. And the things that people normally are going to do is they are going to generate crude estimates of the association. And then once they do that, they adjust them if they need to for confounding. And as I said, there's different ways of adjusting. There's standardizing, stratified, and multivariate. And again, won't go into detail on those, just know that they exist. And then, as I said, every study also has in common is that we have to communicate our findings. And then once you find something interesting or not interesting, so if you find an association or you find no association, it is important to tell people within that scientific community what you have found. If you have found something that is very significant, then you also want to have it be used for treatment purposes or intervention purposes. So where do people publish your findings? Well, there's peer-reviewed journals, but there's also conferences and meetings, sometimes government reports. Increasingly, you see people go to popular media. Not always a good idea, because if you have not been vetted through the peer review process, you may end up embarrassing yourself. So I found this amazing thing, and then your peer reviewers tell you, no, you didn't. But it is not a bad idea to go through the peer review process, and once it's going to be published, have your institution publish it to the popular media, because it does get out. There are some downsides. You've probably, if you follow nutrition, let's say if nutrition is something that interests you, you can get a little bit, the public gets a little frustrated. Eggs are bad for you. Eggs are good for you. Eggs are bad for you. We're back to eggs are bad for you. Well, why is that happening? Well, variety of reasons, different populations, different amounts of exposure to eggs. How many eggs are you eating? So that does get a little frustrating. Some people would say going to the popular media is never a good idea, but I think people can handle it, and hopefully they'll talk to the nutritionist or their physician. But anyway, so now we talked about what they all have in finding. They all have in common. So how do you decide on a study design? So we know that there's a lot of things in common, but there's obviously a difference in analytic scientific studies. We're going to find that some, as I said earlier, are experimental, and some are going to be observational. In the experimental type design, and here you can put in parentheses quasi-experimental. Probably should have added that earlier, but I didn't. Just because I like to upload these, and then I am so bad at typing. Okay. So in this area, what is going to happen is that the investigator actually manipulates that exposure variable, right? So they're actually going to put that treatment or that intervention under their control. And you will see that in clinical trials and experimental studies. These first two have random allocation of treatment or intervention. So there's randomization. And then in the quasi-experimental design, I will also manipulate the exposure, but I will not do random assignment. And then in the observational one, is sometimes it's talked about as a natural study. Here the investigator observes nature as it takes its course. So in a cohort study, people are already exposed or unexposed by the nature of the life they're leading, and then you just follow them over time and see the incidence of an outcome. And in a case control study, you start backwards. You start with people who are either cases or controls, and then you interview them and you figure out, or you read through maybe medical charts or employment records. You try to figure out whether or not they were exposed in the past. So these, the investigator does not allocate treatment, and these they do. So let's look at an experimental design. And when you look at experimental, clinical trial fits under the experimental, but you're looking at why we do them. Well, we study preventions and treatments for diseases. That's the main reason to do experimental studies. They the key features is that you have an investigator and they will assign individuals to 2 or more groups. So the groups are usually called the arms of the study. Very basically, you have a treatment and a placebo. So you have people who either get the treatment or don't get the treatment. And then you follow those 2 groups over time for incidence of some outcome of interest. When do you do an experimental study? When it is ethical and when it is feasible. Obviously, exposing people to some types of exposures is unethical, right? So if I said, well, we're really interested in knowing how methamphetamine use affects performance of graduate students in an epidemiology class, that would be unethical, right? Because I would be assigning people to an arm with methamphetamine, which I know is harmful and illegal. And, you know, it's really unethical. Now, if I have students that are already using it, I hope not. That would be an observational study. Okay, the other thing that happens is in experimental studies, you can look at small effects because you have done randomization. So we'll talk a little bit of why that happens, but you can see a small effect. You don't need to have a giant effect to see something, to see an effect. And the other thing about them is they're expensive. So you, in a setting in where there's money available, an experimental study is nice to do. And the way it looks is you have some kind of source population, and then you randomly assign people to the treatment group or the comparison group. And in clinical trials, it's often called placebo, or the treatment of the normal treatment. And then once you do that, you follow both groups over time, and you try to determine what is the incidence of either of an outcome, either say disease occurrence, a symptom improvement, survival, possible side effects. All those different things can be studied over time. Then, as I said, I added in the quasi-experimental. And the reason I do that is because as health educators, that's more likely to be what you do, and also often what you read in a lot of studies. But again, the main thing is to study the effectiveness of interventions. The key features are going to be that the investigator controls the allocation of treatment or the intervention. They actually determine who gets treatment, who doesn't get treatment. And then the other important thing is this allocation of treatment is not random. So that's different from what you had in the experimental or clinical trial. And for this setting, well, it really should be limited to places where you have somewhat equivalent sites that are available for comparison, because you're really not allocating treatment. So you're hoping that those 2 groups are similar enough to each other that there isn't some kind of horrible bias taking place. The other thing is they are low cost. They don't require the same amount of money as a clinical trial, and they're easy to implement. They really don't require they're easier to implement, and they're easier to analyze. They don't tend to require a lot of statistical skill. So just because your book doesn't talk about it as much, I just kind of wanted to go over this again, talk about a quasi-experimental research resembles experimental research. That's why we call it quasi. Quasi means almost. So it's almost experimental, but it's not true experimental. So even though that independent variable or the exposure is manipulated, the participants are not randomly assigned to either the conditions. So the big thing, so I would say like the take-home message for quasi-experimental design, or in a nutshell, those that receive the intervention are compared to those who are not. That's basically all you're doing. So you have a group receiving an intervention, a group that is not. Remember, true experiments require that subjects be randomly assigned. And what happens when you don't randomly assign subjects is that you can't really be sure that those variables that might bias or confound a study are equally distributed in those 2 populations. That's what random assignment does. It tries to make those two groups as similar as possible.
So
Again,
if a study design doesn't have the randomization of the groups, then it's not considered a true experimental study.
it is not considered a true experimental design. Yeah. And if for people who are purists, I think if you talk to most epidemiologists, I think the word that people say, it makes them queasy to think about a quasi-experimental design. And the reason is that randomization, by the laws of probability, um, not, I wouldn't say ensures, because you can never ensure anything, but it increases the likelihood that any differences among people are equally distributed in those two groups.
Yeah.
But if you don't randomly allocate, you have no idea, you know, whether they're different or not. But they're often done because in community settings, it is very difficult to randomize. So let's say I have two groups of people that are looking at smoking cessation. So I have, let's say, a church group at one church, say the Baptist church. They are interested in participating in a group, but a Methodist are also interested in participating. And I decide, hey, you know, I'll do the informed consent, but one group is going to get the usual talks after, you know, at 6 p.m. And the other group is going to get the usual talks at 6 p.m., but they're also going to go on social media with the group that, you know, they're going to share information on social media and act as social support for each other. So I've got that first group that isn't getting the social media support and the other ones that are. Well, the thing is, to randomly allocate those individuals is going to be difficult. I'm not going to tell the people at the Methodist church, hey, you know what, on Wednesday nights, instead of going to your church, go to another one. They're going to be like, I don't think so, right? So sometimes groups of people do not want to be randomly allocated. They, especially in group settings, they want to remain in that group because it's a natural group. So I wouldn't say quasi-experimental should never be done. Sometimes it's the only option. It just doesn't, and there are ways to make it experimental. They're just really they're really expensive, because I could say to you, well, then get 10 Baptist churches and 10 Methodist churches and then randomly allocate those churches to treatment. Well, then you're talking more money. So every time you do experimental, it's expensive. So, and then this is just a drawing, same as the other one. You have the source population, one to treatment, one to comparison. And here the investigator assigns people to groups, but it's non-random, a random assignment. You follow them over time. And more often than not, we're looking at changes in knowledge, attitudes, skills, and behaviors. You could do a long-term follow-up and look at changes in outcome, but usually that also requires money. And most people who do quasi-experimental studies are there because of a budget constraint. And this is what it normally looks like in most textbooks that talk about it. This is there are 3 different types of quasi-experimental design, but I'm only talking about one. This is the non-equivalent group design. And basically it says this: you have people at baseline, and those people are different. This is your non-equivalent group. These are also people at baseline. Notice they're not the same people, right? Have the little pluses and the little X's.
Or
I'm sorry?
are you supposed to be sharing a screen with us, or
Am I not? Yes, I am. Am I not? Oh goodness, oh God, you guys are so patient. Thank you. I'm sorry. I will put the slides up though, I promise.
Okay.
Yes, I'm making you guys, oh gosh, you guys are patient people. You should have been screaming. Yeah, you've been doing this for almost 30 minutes. Okay, so this is what it normally looks like. So this is what I've been showing you to this point, right? So we had a source population, treatment group, comparison group, follow people over time. That's what you get. Now, in reality, it kind of looks like, you know, I'm getting people into 2 populations and they're going to be similar to each other. But in reality, this is how it's usually demonstrated. You've got baseline, notice the little pluses, and then you've got the other people are the little X's, right? So they're not the same people. They're not equivalent groups. And then I follow them up over time, and then I'm going to compare them later. I'm comparing them, the individuals that are receiving the intervention and the non-equivalent group that is not receiving the intervention. So, what people normally do in these cases is they are either going to do, for some groups, a pre-test, post-test. Most cases what you do is you're going to do a t-test of non-equivalent groups. So, but we'll do that in biostats. Okay, so we've talked about experimental and clinical trial, and we've talked about quasi-experimental, and now we move to the observational. So we're done with the experimental designs, moving into the cohort, into the observationals, and these are cohort and case control. So cohort study, okay, so what are the reasons we would do a cohort study? Well, same similar things. We study causes. We're looking at what are some possible causes for disease, what are the factors that are associated with incidence of the disease, and we are hoping from there to come up with preventions and treatments for diseases. What's the key feature? Okay, this is important. So what happens is I look at my subjects, and I am going to determine what their exposure level is. That is my very first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to start off by looking at my subjects, and I'm going to determine what their exposure level is. So in a very basic sense, it's exposed, not exposed, but it could be exposed a lot, exposed a little less, exposed, not exposed, very little exposure, no exposure at all. So it could be levels of exposure, but that's the first thing. So whenever you see a study and that's what you're following people on the level of exposure, and then you're either following them forward in time or backward in time for disease occurrence, then you have a cohort study. So that the big thing for cohort studies is I'm going to define who my population is by the level of exposure. So when do I do a cohort study? Well, when a clinical trial is not ethical. So for example, when I don't want to give students methamphetamine. Also, when a trial is not feasible because it's either ethical, but it could be that it's very spread out. Maybe it's too expensive and there's just no money for it. What kinds of effects am I expecting? Well, a cohort study, I can't be, if I'm expecting a very small effect, I'm probably not going to see it. So I'm expecting a moderate or large effect in order to do a cohort study. It's great if I don't know very much about the exposure, because what I can do is I can evaluate many effects of the exposure. So if I've already determined that there are a group of people that are exposed to radon, for example, let's move off the methamphetamine. So we're looking at exposed to radon or not, and we're not really sure what does radon really do to the body. Is I can, as long as I have people who are exposed and people who are not exposed, and I'm following them through time, I could be looking at things like cancer, or I could be looking at things like, heart disease, or I could be looking at Parkinson's. I could be looking at any number of outcomes. So if I don't know a lot about what that exposure does, I can look at many effects of that exposure. The other thing is it works when the exposure is rare. Okay, so if you have a very rare exposure, almost any other observational design makes it very difficult. So what does it look like? Well, I have a source population, and from that source of population, I'm going to find people who are exposed, and I'm going to find people who are going to be my unexposed, or my comparison group, and then I'm going to follow them either forward or backward in time. There's prospective and retrospective studies, but there is a time component, and then I'm going to look for the incidence of my outcome of interest. So that's cohort. And as I said, there's prospective cohorts. So that's kind of, I think, the more intuitive for most people. So we have the past, and here I have my study, and then I have the future. And so I select my cohort at the start of the study, and then I determine who's exposed, and I determine who's unexposed, and then I follow them across time into the future, and I compare for disease incidence. So that's what my prospective study looks like. But I can also have a retrospective study. And so in the start of the study, which would be here, I'm determined that what I want to do is I want to compare incidence of disease. And so what I want to know is, we know that people have been exposed and unexposed. So I go into my study and I start by grabbing people. I start determining, are you exposed or are you unexposed, right? I don't go backwards from incidence. What I do is I go backwards from exposed and unexposed, because that's the first thing. So I select my cohort, find out if they're exposed, find out who's unexposed, and then look in the records to see if there's incidence of disease. So when you see a lot of retrospective studies, a lot of the times they're done in occupational settings. So people who have worked in occupations that may expose them to things like asbestos or silica or something that might be affecting them and it's job related. A lot of the times you'll see retrospective cohort studies because of the fact that you can find exposure data in those in their employment records. So it's pretty common in that discipline. Now, for case control studies, in the case control study, we use them to study causes. We want to know what are the things that may be causing a condition. They're also eventually used for prevention and treatment of disease. The main thing that you do in a case control study is, as the name says, is we look for cases. We look for people who have been identified as having the disease, and we also look at people hopefully who are as similar as possible to the cases, except they don't have the disease. Okay, and so once we know that, once we have a group of people who have the disease and a group of people who don't, who are known as our controls, then we determine whether or not they were exposed. So case control studies, we are going to start off by starting with, are you a case or are you a control? Whereas in a cohort study, I start off by saying, are you exposed or not exposed? When do we do a case control study? Well, when a trial is not ethical, feasible, or it's too expensive, so many of the same conditions as a cohort study. Again, if you have a very small effect, it's going to be hard to detect, so we're expecting a moderate to large effect. It's great when little is known about a disease or when a disease is very rare. So if you have very rare diseases that are not likely to be popping up in the population, a case control study is efficient because if we follow a cohort over time, the chances of a rare disease occurring are pretty small. But if I'm interested in a rare disease, if I find a pool of people who are exposed, and then I can somehow match them or get them a control from a similar source population, then I can compare those two groups, the cases and the controls. So in a case control study, you have the source population, and you start off by saying, hey, who are my cases and who are my controls? So I am going to be basing their participation on whether or not they have a disease. And then I'm going to ask them questions. I am going to look at medical records. I'm going to do everything possible to determine whether or not they have been exposed. So it's working backwards from what people normally think of a cohort study. So here we go to the graphical representation, again, the ones that you missed. So I'm just going to focus on experimental, cohort, and case control. So in the experimental study, remember, you start with a source population, and you are going to randomly allocate treatment. So you have random allocation, people to treatment and people to a comparison group. You're going to follow them across in time, and you're going to compare incidence of an outcome in those two groups. Cohort study. I start with my source population, but now this is an observational study, right? So I am not going to assign treatment. What I'm doing is I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to look to see who is exposed, and I'm going to look for people who are not exposed, and I am going to follow those two groups across time. And the same way, I'm going to then compare incidence of an outcome in those two groups. And then there's the case control study. And in the case control study, again, I have a source population. I don't assign treatment because this is also an observational study. But now I'm going to determine who is in my study by looking at people who have the disease and people who are similar to those folks, but they don't have the disease. And so what I do then is I follow I follow up with them, and I ask them questions, and I determine whether or not they were exposed to that exposure of interest. So let's try it out, because you have some of these on the homework, and I know at least one person sent me an email asking me, how does this work? So let's say I have a study in which I want to evaluate the relationship between breast cancer and a woman's history of breastfeeding. So the investigator selects women with breast cancer and an age-matched sample of women who live in the same neighborhoods as the women with breast cancer, but these women don't have breast cancer, they're a control. And both groups of women are interviewed to determine if they breastfed any of their children. So what does this look like? Is that a experimental study, a case control study, a cohort study? What was it?
Experiment.
Case control?
It is case control. Why is it case control?
Okay.
Everybody's coming from the same population.
Okay, everybody is coming from the same population, but what's the key? Because technically in all the studies, everybody should come from the same population, but what makes it a case control and not cohort or experimental?
It has no treatment being rendered to anyone.
Okay, so it's definitely not experimental. And how do we know it's not a cohort study?
Well, don't you have now a sample of
They're
another
not
group?
following anyone over time.
But more importantly, because the overtime can get you, trust me, especially when you start looking at prospective studies. What starts is I am going to start with women with breast cancer.
Breast cancer, then age
And
now.
I am going to match them to women that are
Sample.
from the same study that don't. So if I start off, every time I get a group of people, and if I start off by saying, okay, these people have the disease and these people don't have the disease, and now I'm going to see if there's an exposure of interest, I've started with a case control. I started with disease and not disease.
Okay.
Okay, so let's look at number 2. A study that evaluates 2 treatments for breast cancer. Women with stage 1 breast cancer are randomized to receive either a lumpectomy alone or lumpectomy with breast radiation. Women are followed for 5 years to determine if there are any differences in breast cancer recurrence and survival. So what does that sound like?
Experimental.
Yes, that's definitely experimental.
Okay.
And it's got what are the words here that are sort of tipping you off?
Randomized and treatment.
Yes. So
And
once you're
values.
talking about randomization, you're talking about treatment allocation. So you are definitely in the field of experimental designs. Good. Okay, so let's look at this one. A study of the relationship between exposure to chest irradiation and subsequent risk of breast cancer that was begun in 2010. In this study, women who received radiation therapy for postpartum mastitis in the 1940s were compared to women who received non-radiation therapy for postpartum mastitis in the 1940s. The women were followed until 2009 to determine the incidence rates of breast cancer for each group.
Cohort.
Is that a cohort?
It is a cohort.
Okay.
And this is one of the ones that could make it tough because it's retrospective, right? So the study is really being done in 2010, but everything happened by 2009.
Yeah.
So, but how did we know it was a cohort and not a case control?
Wouldn't it be the time passes?
Well, there is time passing, but what's more? What is it I'm looking at?
What we compare the incident rates?
We always compare incidence
Okay.
rate. But what is the exposure? What is the exposure here in this study?
Radiation.
Chest radiation.
The radiation therapy. And I started off by saying these women who receive radiation therapy for postpartum mastitis compared to women who did not get radiation therapy for postpartum mastitis. So they're a very similar group of women. They both had postpartum mastitis, so they had a child and they had some kind of infection of the milk ducts, and it was both in the 1940s. So we have very similar populations, but we have 2 different exposures. And then those women, we look at their medical records, because obviously if you are diagnosed with breast cancer, that's going to be in your medical record. So we follow them from the 1940s when they first get treatment all the way to 2009. So, okay, and what about this last one, number 4, a study of the relationship between exposure to postmenopausal hormone therapy and subsequent risk of breast cancer that will begin in January 2016. In this study, postmenopausal women who receive hormone therapy during 2016 will be compared to postmenopausal women who do not receive the therapy. The women will be followed until 2026 to determine the incidence rates of breast cancer in each group. What
Is
does
that
that one
also
look
a
like?
cohort?
That's probably too.
Is that also
It
a
is.
cohort?
It is also cohort, and it is prospective. And how do we know that?
Mhm.
So what's the exposure?
Postmenopausal
Hormone therapy.
Okay, the hormone therapy. Okay. And we know women who receive it versus women who do not receive it.
Okay. Yeah.
So those are going to be your two exposures. So this, I think the easiest thing to do, I mean, for me, when I first started doing these, I thought they were pretty tricky. I think if you see any treatment allocation, if it's like I give somebody a treatment or I place you in an intervention, then you're looking at experimental. If I have randomization, it is a true experimental. If I don't randomize, it's quasi-experimental. Okay. So those are unique. Then the other possibilities that you're observational. And in observational, if I start off by these people are cases and these people are controls, or these people are cases and these people are not, I'm in the case control study. If I start off with, there are people who've been exposed and people who have not been exposed, or I'm interested in the exposure of, hormone therapy. And so I'm going to follow people with hormone therapy versus people who never got hormone therapy. I may not use the word exposure, but that's what they're talking about. It's a cohort study. Okay. I'm not as concerned normally with whether you realize if it's retrospective or prospective, because really it's not that relevant. Most of the studies you run into tend to be prospective in health ed. Again, if you start focusing primarily on occupational type stuff, you'll see more retrospective. But as long as you can tell me it's a cohort study, we'll be happy. Okay, so let's say that you are trying to decide, well, what should if I'm going to be actually conducting studies, how do I determine what my design is? Is it because it's my favorite design, or is it because it's the only one I know? Sometimes for some people, but really it should be driven by your research question or your hypothesis. So that's really the first place. It should also be driven by what we know scientifically. So if we are thinking, hey, this is a pretty moderate effect, it is, we do have a hypothesis that is talking about a possible exposure effect on a particular outcome. If we know whether exposure is very rare or if the disease is very rare, that helps us make a determination. Also, if it's an ethical consideration, if allocation of treatment is absolutely not ethically appropriate, then again, you would not pick a clinical trial, for example. And then the other thing we always worry about is it going to be a valid study? Is there going to be, so in other words, is there bias? Did I control for confounding? Have I tried to minimize all sources of error? And is it, when we talk about efficiency, is it using my time and money wisely? So which one am I going to use? Well, in theory, it's possible to use all three designs to test a hypothesis. So let's say we have a hypothesis here. People who consume a diet high in vitamin A have a lower risk of lung cancer over a 10-year period as compared to people who consume a diet low in vitamin A. So I have a hypothesis stated. So what is our exposure for this hypothesis?
Vitamin A.
Yay, the diet, the vitamin A levels in the diet, great. And what is our outcome?
Lung cancer?
Yes, exactly. So we know we have an exposure, we know that we have an outcome, so one of these designs is certainly able to be done. Additionally, giving somebody vitamin A, is that unethical? No, right? So if I wanted to use an experimental design, I could, right? Ethically, I could do it. Okay. And let's see. Can I measure vitamin A consumption? Is it measurable?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So we can measure it. One of the ways of doing vitamin A consumption is to do a food frequency questionnaire, an FFQ. And so usually it's analyzed by people who are registered dietitians, but people will write down the food that they consume every 24 hours, and they can, by looking at what you consume, determine how much vitamin A you're consuming. That's why you usually have a registered dietitian doing it. I wouldn't want to do that. But anyway, that is measurable, and you have your exposure. So let's see, if you did it as a case control study, what would it look like, right? You would start with your source population, and you would say to yourself, okay, cases of lung cancer, because it's cases, right? So I find cases of lung cancers, and then I find people similar to my cases, but who do not have lung cancer. And then I'm going to ask them questions. So I can do food frequency questionnaires and determine whether or not they were exposed to sufficient levels of vitamin A or not. So how much vitamin A they had. So that's how you can conduct this study as a case control study. Now, looking at these, what are some of the problems that might arise from doing a case control study for this? Okay, so
people don't answer the questionnaire right.
Yeah, I mean, think about lung cancer takes a while to develop. Most cancers or chronic diseases are not something that happen overnight, right? It's not like, hey, you know, you caught a bug and you got sick the next day. It doesn't quite work that way. So if I'm asking you what you ate yesterday and how much of it, that's kind of tough for most people, right? Heck, for some people, what did you have for breakfast can be a tough thing. So if I'm asking you, what did you eat for the last 25 years? And it's not like they're going to write this in their medical record. So unless they have been, I don't know, writing down everything they eat for the last 25 years, there are going to be some issues with the measurement of that variable. So those are some possibilities that are going to end up creating a problem for the researcher, that we're not going to be able to know whether or not they were exposed. The other thing that happens is when somebody's diagnosed with a disease, something like lung cancer, which is pretty serious, you become very hypercritical about everything that you've ever done, right? Because you want to determine why it is you have this condition. Your friends and relatives are going to try to say, well, maybe it's because you did this, right? So they're also going to answer questions a little more differently than the people that don't have the disease. They're like, why are you asking me, right? You know, so also there can be a bias introduced because people are very aware of what they could have or not, you know, done or not done in those situations. Now let's look at a cohort study. And in a cohort study, we again start with a source population, but this time what I want to look at is I'm going to look at people who eat a lot of vitamin A already. They're like, yep, I love everything that contains vitamin A. I love my carrots or something along those lines. And then you have the low vitamin A group. These people are not into it at all. Okay. And then I'm going to, once I've determined who those folks are, I'm either going to prospectively or retrospectively, I'm going to follow them across time, and I'm going to compare lung cancer incidence. Now, what are some of the issues that can happen with this particular design that could be a problem?
What are the problems?
Mm-hmm. Well, this one, this goes back to something I said before the slides were showing. So you'd be relying entirely on your auditory memory, which is not always great for most of us. It helps to have something visual. So one of the things I had said early on is cohort studies are really great for rare exposures, but they're not really that efficient for rare outcomes, right? And in some ways, vitamin A is not an uncommon exposure, right? and we would be in trouble. Lung cancer is not that terribly common. I mean, it's common enough if you have it, but it's really not super common. So it is conceivable that I have a cohort study with a few hundred people, let's say, which wouldn't be that's a very small cohort study, and I follow them over time, and I follow them all the way till their death, and nobody develops lung cancer. So there are, unless I have a very large cohort, right, which is going to be very, very expensive, I may not see the effect of vitamin A on lung cancer. I may not have enough people who develop lung cancer to make this a viable comparison. Right? Because then you have to have people in both groups in order to be able to compare. And, we're not, we have a fairly common exposure with a kind of a rare outcome. So that could be a problem that takes place with our cohort design. And then let's look at our experimental study. What is happening here? We have a source population, and we are now going to say, you guys are going to get high vitamin A, and you guys are going to get low vitamin A, and then we're going to follow you over time and compare lung cancer incidence. So what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of this study? And we've been focusing on weaknesses. So what are some of the weaknesses in this study?
The people that are receiving the low vitamin A could possibly be having other sources of vitamin A that will make
vitamin A deficiency is a problem, right? So we know that there are issues. So we're now moving into an area that may not make this terribly ethically feasible, right?
Okay.
So all of a sudden people are like, yeah, but vitamin A deficiency is a problem. We don't want that to happen. What other issues could also take place? We did say lung cancer is not super common, right?
No.
So this is going to take a very large population again, right? I'm going to have a lot of people allocated to high vitamin A and a lot of people allocated to low vitamin A.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to have to follow them an awful long time because lung cancer takes a while to develop for most people. Because, if you know anybody who's had lung cancer, it tends to be older folks, right? It's not usually your 20-year-olds that are developing, right? So it's going to take a while to get there. And then you may not get as many people that develop the disease as possible. So I want you to just notice this. We looked at the weaknesses. What are some of the issues that arise from this design? There isn't a perfect design. What you do is I think the ethics is super important. I think weighing the ethics in I am the chair of the IRB in the department. So I look at the ethical treatment of human subjects. So that's, to me, is one of the things I look at. And I think if you're working with humans, it probably ought to be one of the main things that people look at. But I also think you need to also focus on expense. I mean, if it's going to require a gigantic cohort, or it's going to require a lot of subjects for your clinical trial, it may not be feasible. Okay, so I think the feasibility from an ethics standpoint, the feasibility from money standpoint, the feasibility from manpower standpoint, those all matter. Okay, so as I said, you will find that there is not going to be a study design that's perfect, but that doesn't stop epidemiologists from conducting their studies. It shouldn't stop you guys from conducting research if at some point that is what you feel called to do. And so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to ask questions. And again, I apologize for not having slides. So I will definitely load these up. And I just feel awful. And I spent a lot of time on some of these things. That really sucks. I wasn't showing them. Any questions?
Yes, I had a question. So
Sure.
in the assignment, the only categories we're using is experimental, case control, and cohort.
Yes, I believe, I'm trying to remember. I have to look at it, but yes. Notice that if there is ever a quasi-experimental thing thrown in, the only thing that's going to distinguish an experimental study from a quasi-experimental study is going to be that it's not randomized. So if you're looking at a quasi-experimental design, it looks just like an experimental design, but you're not going to have random allocation. Okay, that's
so
the
what about,
main
what about
difference.
a cross-sectional study? Is that an option? Because I was,
Yeah, we talked about cross-sectional studies last week, and yeah, usually I often do, particularly on tests, add a cross-sectional study. What happens in a cross-sectional study is, in most cases, they're either going to be an interview or a survey,
okay.
because you're going to measure both the exposure and you're going to measure the outcome at the same time. So you measure both. So if I did a survey and I wanted to, let's say the same question where I was looking at vitamin A, and I was looking at cancer incidence, instead of doing all this rigmarole, I would have a source population and I would give them all a survey, right? So we would going just one line going this way. And in that survey, I would ask them about their vitamin intake, and I would ask them if they've been diagnosed with lung cancer. It really wouldn't be very good for this study at all. I mean, it really wouldn't be very good for this study at all, but it's often done as a way of generating hypotheses. And for masters, so let's say somebody wants to do research at the master's level, it's really very common to do, I would say most at the master's level, most people do a cross-sectional study. They usually do a survey and they have an outcome of interest and they have an exposure of interest, and they measure both at the same time and see if there's an association. You can't say what caused it. One didn't come before the other. So you have that temporal problem that we talked about, I think it was last week. You don't know what came first, but you measure both at the same time. If you see an association, however, let's say that you did this weird study as a cross-sectional study and you're like, ooh, how weird. The only two people who said they had lung cancer also said they don't like vitamin A foods. Then you might say, oh, maybe it's time to have a hypothesis, you know, let's do a study based on that. And so it's a good way of generating hypotheses. I don't remember when I mean, it's been a while since I wrote this other thing, but there may be a cross-sectional. Usually I do it for the test, but I may have done it for the homework. If I did, that's the big difference, is that in a cross-sectional study, I would measure both at the same time. Another thing that people sort of sometimes have issues with case control studies is that sometimes we become very focused on this person has the disease versus this person doesn't have the disease. But sometimes it's done a little bit differently. So the way they may present it is that they may say, for example, that it may be like a biological measurement. So it may not be a disease, but you may be looking at somebody that has, you know, a blood pressure over a certain number versus these people have a blood pressure below a certain number. And so it's not really a disease versus not disease, but it's still giving you, that's the outcome of interest that you're interested in. So sometimes people are like, well, that's not really technically a disease. Well, yeah, if that's your outcome of interest, you know, the case versus, if your case is blood pressure over a certain number or below a certain number, then that's okay. That is also could be a case control study. Any other questions?
All right.
Nope, we're good.
I had trouble getting on.
Oh, okay. Onto the Zoom.
Yeah. And I finally just typed it in at the top. I thought, why don't I type it in the top?
Oh, how weird
It
is
took
that?
me like 30 minutes and I could not get on.
Okay, this is the other thing. My suggestion, if you have problems with Zoom, is download it onto your computer. So actually, you can download Zoom, right?
Okay.
And then let me go to the announcements and show you something to look at.
Okay.
So then you can join a conference, but what you can do, well, did I close? Yeah, hold on. Let me go to the announcement real quick. It has a meeting ID.
Yeah.
And then you can type the meeting ID into the because sometimes, yeah, I don't know why that happens.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't get on.
announcements to 5:14. Let's look at the meeting ID. Okay. So if we go in here, notice that there's, okay, so that you're going in to join Zoom by going up here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you right, if you download Zoom, right, if you download the app, it shows up on your desktop like a little video camera, I think.
Okay.
If you do that, then you can type in this meeting ID.
Okay.
Okay, and that one, and I mean, that should get you into
Okay.
the meeting that you want, and it's more stable than that using the URL.
Okay.
Okay. But if you're working on somebody else's computer and you can't download stuff to it, then.
Yeah.
And Richard, if you still have trouble, let me know and we'll work through it. Okay.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay, and I will post the video at the latest tomorrow morning. I don't know how long it's going to take to download. And I'm sorry, half of it doesn't have video, but I will put the slides up for you. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye, good night.
Night.
Night.